Okay. So what I want to focus on in this webinar is both helping women get into technology and also helping mid-career women thrive in leadership roles. And for those of you who are very unfamiliar with my work, I've been interviewing successful women leaders in tech for the past few years to capture their stories, mindsets, successes, and missteps, so that there is more information available about how to help women thrive in leadership in tech and beyond. If you're new to tech or you want to get into tech or more, you'll find some valuable insights in this webinar. So just jumping to the presentation. If you look at some of the numbers today, you've got 50.8% of the US population, they're women. And women are 59% of the college educated entry-level workforce today. And 9% of management positions in IT are held by women. So it's a very, very small percentage. What's even more disturbing is if you look at Fortune 500 companies today, you have around 24 women running these companies. That means the remaining are run by men. 70% of that are run by white men. So white men are really powerful at this point in time. And we have very few women running these Fortune 500 companies. And it's even worse for women of color. So if you look at just the rate of change since the early 2000s, if you look at this, it's actually, we can feel proud about ourselves, right? We'll be like, we're constantly seeing the number of women CEOs increase since 2000. We did have a drop in 2018. We dropped down from 32 women to 24 women. And even though we're seeing this rate of change, and I'm not a sociologist, so I can't really tell you how these different dynamics that works in organizations can project some of these numbers, but if you just linearly graph this, it won't be until 3075 that we can see equal number of women CEOs at Fortune 500 companies. That is pretty scary. And I hope you all realize that 3075 is just ridiculous. We can't wait until 3075. There's another study that talks about just with the rate of change today, we won't see until 2085. And, that's my daughter, and just my work as, mother, a writer, and a female leader in tech. I wanted to create role models for my daughter because she will be in her 70s if we take the 2085 number. And she won't see equality until 2085. And if you have a daughter at home, you have a sister who's, of a younger generation, please know that this is pretty serious, that we won't be able to achieve this, 67 years from now, which I think should stop everyone in their tracks. And we should try to hasten this process. And that's been my work. What I did was I wanted to create these role models. And it wasn't just for my daughter. When I got into the mid-management level at VMware, I was very stuck in my career. And one of the reasons was that I joined a business unit that was primarily run by men. I had absolutely no sponsors. It was an old boys club. I showed great potential. Everyone talked about it, but it was hard to get into that click. That was when I decided to go off on this journey because it wasn't just me who was struggling. There were a lot of women in my organization who were struggling. I went off to find a successful woman because at that point I was like, where are all these women? So I dug very deep into my network and I found around 20, 25 women who have been successful in their own right, who've been CEOs of companies, who have been in senior VP positions, who are women on boards, who are very high up in the engineering technical track. And I went off and I interviewed these women and I started to tell just their personal stories. And my goal was just to have at least one person read a story and walk away with something that's meaningful to them, that could change the trajectory of their lives, and for them to go off and do something with whatever information they could gather from the stories. As I was doing research for the book, apart from just the disturbing fact that we won't reach equality until 2085, we've heard this constant thing in tech that it is a pipeline problem. But what I found is that that's actually not true. It isn't, there's several factors, but for us to constantly say it's a pipeline problem, we need to challenge that. And that's one of the action items I would like for you to take away from this, is to challenge the status quo in your organizations. When people say it's a pipeline problem, you have to educate them a bit. In this case, Tiffany Whitney, who's the co-founder of Grace Hopper celebrations, and if you've been to those celebrations, you will find that 23,000 young girls are at the conference learning technical, learning new technology, emerging technology. They're there to network, they're there to find jobs. And companies don't really prioritize going to these conferences to hire these women. So it's really not a pipeline problem. It is a problem where there's a lot of bias that happens within a hiring process. So, when you get resumes of a girl versus a man, a woman versus a man, and we do go through this interview panel or this hiring process, there is this bias that kicks in, which we're not aware of. And it's very unconscious. It's very unconscious bias. And what's even worse is people of color. So if you find people of color graduating from universities and they apply for positions in tech, they can't make it. I was talking to one person who, his name is Jose, and he is a technical guy. And he always told me, hey, Pratima, when they look at my name, they think I'm a house cleaner. And so we have these biases that actually prevent us from really looking hard and questioning ourselves and trying to change our mindset around this. The next thing I want to talk about is the glass ceiling. And this is, is something that I assumed was, that we had one glass ceiling, and if we broke that, there would be no other glass ceiling and we would just attain nirvana. That's actually not true. What I found is you can break a glass ceiling and there's another glass ceiling that'll emerge. And that's pretty much what happened with me. Like, I felt like I was breaking glass ceilings until I got to the mid-management level, and then I got stuck. And once I break that, I know I'm gonna have another one. And this was a similar experience with the women in the book. They experience the glass ceiling at every level, which makes it much more harder for us. The next one is imposter syndrome, and this is actually pretty close to my heart. It's just this feeling that you're not good enough. And men also feel imposter syndrome. It's just not a syndrome that women feel. And a lot of high functioning women tend to have imposter syndrome. And what I realized through just conversations with these women and talking to a lot of people out after the book was published was imposter syndrome is actually good for you. And the way it's good for you is it pushes you out of your comfort zone. So for instance, just my example, I just recently started running blockchain for VMware. And blockchain is, it's an emerging tech. There's a lot of hype around it. We're trying to make sense of what we want to do with blockchain. But at the same time, the concepts are hard in blockchain. There's cryptography, there's game theory, there's economics that you have to learn. There's, it's distributed systems as well as decentralized trust. And so there's a lot of concepts within blockchain. And when I took over the blockchain engineering team, I had imposter syndrome. I still have imposter syndrome today. But what's helped me in the last 6 to 8 months since I took over that team is I know so much more than I did before. And just going through that feeling of, oh, I don't know this, and I'm sitting in a meeting and I don't understand these concepts, and I'm supposed to run this engineering team, I went off and I took a course and I learned more. I'm doing panel talks on blockchain and I'm reading and I'm doing all these things, and I feel much more confident about it, but I know I'm not there yet. And it's this constant feeling every day that I battle, but I know that I am in such a better place than I was a couple of months ago. And so imposter syndrome is actually good for you. And when you have that feeling, embrace it and do something about it. And you will find that, greatness is just around the corner. And I'm not just saying it because I'm living it. The other thing I want to talk about is career interventions. And I know there's questions on how do we get women in tech? How do we get girls in tech? How do we get women to climb these ladders. And what I found is, you've got the formal career interventions and you've got the informal career interventions. And some of the best career interventions you can find are these informal career interventions. This is just a perspective that people give you on just new possibilities in your career. So there are many stories in the book where people have had these informal career interventions. If you read a story by Dr. Orna Berry, she's the chief scientist. She was the first female chief scientist at Israel. And I actually met her in Israel last year. And she's a celebrity in Israel, and she's fairly powerful. She used to work for EMC. Now she's retired. But she talks about this story where she was driving her professor home, and she just finished her master's degree and she wanted to go and start working. And you have to know that the Israeli culture is they're very big on PhDs. So her professor basically told her, he said, Orna, I won't tell you you're smart, but there are a lot of dumber people than you who have a PhD. And he said, if you want to go get a PhD, I will recommend you. And she decided to get a PhD, and she told me that was the best thing ever. And she told me that the PhD actually helped her achieve a lot of things. Like she started companies, she sold companies, she worked very closely with Michael Dell, Dell EMC. She works very closely with Pat Gelsinger, and she's a very successful woman in her own right. And today she is encouraging a lot of women to get PhDs. How do I feel about that? I personally, I don't have a PhD, and, I've never felt the need to get a PhD, but just that intervention that she had that really transformed her career, and it came from her professor, which I think is very interesting. And so what that tells you is you are empowered to make those career interventions with, your female colleagues or your daughter or your sister or even your mother, right? Like the women in your life, you can feel empowered to make those career interventions because you never know what that can do for them. This next one is mentorship versus sponsorship. And this is something I feel is very critical for women to get into leadership roles and get to the top. Mentors actually talk with you and sponsors talk about you. That's the difference between mentors and sponsors. And what I found is for women, women have very few sponsors. And that actually hurts them. And that's one of the reasons why you don't see them get these top leadership positions. And women also lack, majority of women lack a network, a large network. And from your network, you can actually find sponsors. And we also lack network because, it's hard for us with work-life balance for us to, go network with people, take time off, after work, hang out. A lot of these, strategic decisions happen like on a golf course. And I have some funny stories in the book where they actually happen in the men's bathroom. So I found this to be critical. And when I hit my glass ceiling in 2016, that was the time I had no sponsor. I had absolutely no sponsor. I didn't have a male sponsor or a female sponsor. I didn't have anyone advocating for me. I did not have anyone saying, oh, Pratima needs this strategic project, or Pratima needs to be promoted. I did not have anyone advocating for me. But the years before that, I did. I did have sponsors, and I didn't know they were sponsors, and they didn't know they were sponsoring me. So it's very important to be surrounded by sponsors. And the majority of the women in the book have had sponsors. There's always been somebody who is advocating for them. If you've been following Erica Lockheimer, who's in the book, she recently got promoted to VP of LinkedIn. And I know that she has many sponsors within LinkedIn, and the CEO, Jeff Weiner himself, is a sponsor of her. So it wasn't surprising that she got to the VP level. And so surrounding yourself with sponsors is very critical. And persistence, my entire book revolves around persistence. When I started to write this book, I wanted to name it There's No Glass Ceiling, because I really, really thought there was no glass ceiling for these women that I was talking to. And I realized that was very naive of me. And as I internalized their stories, there was a common theme that kept emerging, and that was persistence. So I picked a very controversial title. I've probably pissed off half the country with that title, but it was important for me to put that in there. And since then, I've realized that persistence is so key for your success. At some point you have to know which battles you want to fight versus which battles you don't have to fight. But just that grit and determination, just last night I was watching a documentary called Climbing this mountain called Meru. It's in the Himalayan mountain, and it talks about these 3 climbers who had so much adversity. They lost people. They had, they had health problems. They had injuries. There was one guy who almost got paralyzed, but they went back and they climbed it the second time and they were successful. And all that was just persistence. It was just this mental grit that they had. And it was also something that they truly, truly, truly wanted, but they persisted through all the adversaries that came in their path. And for women or even entrepreneurs today, persistence is key, because life is not going to be easy. There's going to be so many obstacles in your way, and showing up the next day is super critical. So I talked about Orna Berry. She, the female chief scientist, she's amazing. She's got some very cool stories, and one of them was on the career intervention that I talked about. What's interesting about Patti Hatter, her story again was, she was raised very similar to me, where I was raised gender blind. I never saw gender. My older sister played cricket for India, and she, won the first World Cup for the country. I watched her play cricket with the boys. My family encouraged us to do whatever we wanted to do and whatever we felt we wanted to do, and we felt we were good, or, it was never like girls do this, boys do this. And Patti was raised very similarly, but when she went to Carnegie Mellon to get her computer science degree, there was a boy named Fred in her class who came to her and said, "Hey, Patti, I'm a friend of yours, and I wanted to tell you this, and before you go down this engineering path, I want to tell you that girls don't do engineering." And for Patti, she thought it was odd because she's never been discouraged. And she looked at him and she said, "Well, thank you, but no thank you." And she went off to be on the dean's list, and Freddie dropped out of Carnegie Mellon. So it's a funny story, but also remember that the messages like this really hurt women's confidence. Patti took it the right way, but most of us are not fortunate enough to take it the right way. Pam is another woman with a lot of grit. She is a CEO, and the way she functions is she always hits a glass cliff. And what I mean by that is she comes in at a stage where the founders are unable to be successful with their company. And so she comes in with a couple of outcomes, which is, save the company or shut the company down. And she has a glass cliff problem, because this is a problem she has to come in and fix. And if she's successful, everyone's like, "Hey, we picked the right person to do this." And if she fails, then it hurts her reputation, and it's hard for her to go off and execute on something else later. And she always gets into this glass cliff situation. But she says, her whole premise was, she went to Harvard Business School. She said that was the hardest thing she's ever done in her life. And as she went through the MBA degree, she had to claw her way through. And that's what she does today. Even when she's a CEO of a failing company, she claws her way through, and she loves the challenge of it. And she's just amazing. Tiffany Whitney, I've talked about her. She had a career intervention from her stepmom, where she went and took this inventory test, and computer science came up, and she went off and got a computer science degree, and she's impacted several women since then. And I talk about just this, this parallel universe where she didn't get that intervention. And if she didn't, she would probably have never been down this path of impacting so many women in her life. So she's got an amazing story. Annabelle is this woman from LinkedIn. She's now doing her own startup company. What I liked about her story was a lot of things that she faced is something that I have faced at work myself, where we have a picture of what leadership means, You know, leaders are supposed to be strong and powerful and have this gravitas. But when a woman comes in and exhibits those same qualities, then it becomes a double bind problem, because then you become very ambitious, you become very aggressive, and you know, those qualities are not really rewarded in a woman. And her story is where she comes in, feels like the feedback she's got is she's authoritarian, she's aggressive, and she had to really work on her brand to become the leader she actually wanted to become. And she did, and she also changed a few mindsets within the company as to what it means to be a female leader, which is actually very critical, because today, if you go into a classroom and you ask kids, draw me a doctor or draw me a leader, or they'll always draw a man. And so we need to change that mindset that yes, women can be leaders as well. And there are certain characteristics that women have that are also part of being a leader. And, you know, it doesn't have to be this one standard that we all have to abide by, and then women have to work so hard towards that standard, and when they do, it goes negatively against them. And so these are some of the things that need a lot of education. So I love talking about a story, because that kind of helps you, it shines light on that. So this is actually very important to me. And when I talk about diversity and inclusion, I mean, we're talking a lot about diversity and inclusion, but we are excluding men, and we need to stop doing that. And so what men and organizations can do, and I say this, and it probably upsets a lot of, you know, women, but the key to diversity in our workplace is men, specifically white men, because they have the power. And so we need policies within our organization to encourage diversity and help all employees, including white men. And that is something that we don't do. For instance, I was talking to this white woman, and she said, Pratima, you know, if there is a conference or there's a talk on women of color, I won't go to that because it doesn't impact me. But the truth of the fact is she needs to go to that conference, because there are many things that happen to women of color that people, or people of non-color people have to listen to, because they're the ones who can actually create some of that change. And so I urge people, when they talk about diversity and inclusion, that you include men and you include everyone. And that is what diversity actually means. And so what can men and organizations do? So some of the things we can do is, having senior women and men. Senior women actually have a lot of influence where they can mentor men to uproot some of this unconscious bias. And I also stress this, that diversity programs within organizations should be truly, truly diverse. And the other thing I've noticed also is there is this talent pool that, that is so critical to our success, because these are the people who come into organizations where organizations don't allow you to thrive. They take a break, you want them to re-enter the workforce. So expanding your talent pool by doing some of these re-entry programs, and VMware is doing that. We have an initiative called Tara in India, where we're trying to get women back into work. I'm trying to do something similar in the United States for VMware. It's in process, and I'm hoping that that can work. Is working with Reboot Axel and trying to get some of these women back into the workforce. And I'm excited about that. Just some closing thoughts on leadership. Wanda Austin is a former CEO of Aerospace Corporation. And she says, to be a successful leader, you must develop skills to clearly define the value of your work. So the why is important. The vision, where you're headed, in addition to being able to specify the strategic and tactical details of how to get there. And this is actually something that resonates with me very much as I lead my blockchain team. Is I'm always thinking about why. Why are we doing this? And where are we going? And what do we need to do, both tactically and strategically, to get there? And so Wanda Austin's constantly mentoring and coaching me as I go through my journey.